my students are here. Okay, that's the worst thing. Is that students that I had in storytelling class are in this room now.
As well they should.
Oh, God. Okay. So I have some newish things for you tonight. And the first story is I've only just started telling it, and it's a first-person story from the point of view of a villain that you will recognize. So, yeah, I have hopes. I have hopes. I once trapped a demon under a jar, but that was nothing compared to dealing with that spoiled brat of a stepdaughter. Snow White could freeze an unwary adult at 20 paces with one gimlet glance from those teenage eyes. She was a royal pain in the royal fanny, whining to her father all the time, throwing around attitude every 5 minutes like confetti. I put a stop to that. Snow White could temper her father into compliance during the day, but the nights belonged to me. And those nights influenced the daytime behavior of the king in a way that Snow White did not appreciate, but could do nothing to affect. When she realized that her father was more enamored of his nights than he was of her days, the temper tantrum that she threw was spectacular, but ultimately unproductive. So she ran away. For just a moment, I thought of what it would be like to just let her go. Well, I was an admirable queen, stepmother not so much. But this teenager was the most spoiled princess to ever gaze into a well, never mind sing to the bunnies. Go get the little brat, I told my husband. Her father would be distressed if anything happened to her. He would be disturbed if she fell off a cliff, drowned in the river, got eaten by wolves. It didn't take the husband very long to catch up with her, and when he did, she threw a fit as only a teenage girl can. I won't go back, she declared. I will never return to the castle as long as that woman, she meant me, remains. Now, as devoted as my husband was, he was not possessed of infinite patience. And finally he said, fine, stay here. I'm going back to the castle before it gets dark and cold. And he left. And Snow White was a little shocked, but there wasn't really much for her to do except go deeper into the woods. On his way back to the castle, the huntsman had second thoughts, and he turned around to follow Snow White, because if the huntsman was afraid of anything, it was me. And he knew if anything happened to Snow White, I, in deference to my husband, the king, would have the huntsman's heart in a box. Deep into the woods, Snow White came upon the cottage of the 7 dwarfs. How did I know that? Well, I have a mirror of my own. Have you heard the story or not? The 7 dwarfs were a bunch of poachers and ne'er-do-much-at-alls, and the huntsman was very familiar with them, and they were open to a bribe, or bribes, as the case may be. And an exchange of gold made the 7 dwarfs quite hospitable to the arrival and extended stay of the little princess. Occasionally, I would feel the need to check up on my stepdaughter, and to that end, I would hide my face under a hat and go for a visit. These visits did not go well, because a drama diva will not be denied her drama. That girl had an attitude that meant she spent a lot of her time alone. And with only her mirrors for company, she embraced the idea of suffering for beauty in a way that should have been left behind long ago. From lacing up her corset so tight that she couldn't breathe, to combing her hair bloody, combing her scalp bloody, trying to style her hair. She even had a problem with fruit. "Look at this," she said to the seven dwarfs, holding up a half-eaten apple. "Look at this, she brought me rotten fruit. That woman is trying to poison me." That woman, she meant me. Really, if I was trying to poison her, The seven dwarfs listened very sympathetically. Visions of golden coins dancing in their heads, but after a while, even gold loses its shine, and they fed her enough chamomile and lavender and maybe just a little poppy to make her go to sleep. And I can't say that I blame them. I'd considered it myself. But Snow White went out and she fell asleep in a hammock strung between two flowering trees. And she didn't awaken even when the prince came riding out of the woods. Oh, the prince. A prince from the neighboring kingdom. Well, he was just looking for a date. But it had to be the right date. Lips as red as blood, hair as dark as ebony, He was driving to every eligible princess within riding distance. He was riding to every eligible princess within riding distance, and when he came to our castle, the princess was not at home. But I was. "Looking for a princess, are you?" I asked. "Indeed, Your Majesty," said the prince, thinking that perhaps he should date up. Queens instead of princesses. Don't look at me like that. I didn't have anything to do with it. My stepdaughter is visiting some friends on the other side of the forest. She is, so her mirrors tell her, the fairest in the land, if that interests you. "Yes, Your Majesty," said the prince, "I am very interested." Oh, wish upon a star, this is going to be easy. Well, she is even more beautiful, as her father, the king, has promised a disturbingly large dowry to the prince she agrees to marry. Oh, I could see that the prince was interested. Beauty, wealth, a royal pedigree. What more could any prince ask for? He still thought that beautiful on the outside meant beautiful on the inside. I almost felt sorry for him. "Do I have your permission to call on the princess?" asked the prince. "Oh, do," I said. "Go. Woo her. Wed her. Take her away." When the prince came riding out of the woods, the first thing he saw was a silken hammock strung between two flowering trees. The blossoms, pink. The blossoms fell from the trees down onto the green grass. The breeze blew melodiously. The hammock swayed. I'm sure that there were tiny deer watching from the woods. And bunnies. And maybe a skunk. The prince looked down at the sleeping princess. Luckily, she was not snoring or drooling. She really did have hair as dark as ebony and lips as red as blood. Her eyes fluttered open as blue as the sky. She gazed upon a young man, stalwart, strong, incredibly healthy, with one lock of carefully gelled curl over his forehead. It was instantaneously intimate, overwhelmingly passionate, and destined for happily ever after. I might have had something to do with that. Prince and princess gave in to destiny and hormones, and off they rode in a swirl of singing birds and dancing sunbeams. An exhausted dwarf brought a surprisingly civil letter from Snow White asking that her dowry be forwarded to her new palace. And wagons full of jewels and gold and household goods were sent off with great enthusiasm. Finally, in a castle without a queen, Snow White turned her gimlet glance to wedding preparations and made the lives of 8 wedding planners, 14 seamstresses, and 6 chefs so miserable that they sought alternative occupations. With the careless disregard of the eminently spoiled, Snow White finally had everything her way. The invitation she sent to her father and I was heavy linen embossed with gold. It was to be the wedding of the season, any season. I was careful not to outshine the bride, but no one could say that I was not formidable. I danced until my feet were burning, and when the ball was over, I walked barefoot to the coach, and I hung my burning feet out the window and leaned against the shoulder of my royal husband and dozed all the way back to a palace empty of drama. Peace, it's wonderful. This is actually a literary tale by Carl Sandburg, very short. Deep Red Roses. Deep Red Roses was a beautiful girl with the blue sunlights of the summer sky in her eyes and lips that reminded you of deep red roses, waiting in the cool of a summer evening. She met shoulder straps one day while she was young yet. A soldier he was, traveling from one country to another, from one war to the next. When he promised, she promised. But then shoulder straps went off to another war, and then another, and another. And in a faraway country, he married another girl. And he forgot all about the promise he made to Deep Red Roses. Hi Hi Over was the next to come along. A dancer he was, dancing from one city to the next, dancing all night long, and sleeping all morning until noon. When he promised, she promised. But then he went away to another city to dance, and then another, and another. Every year there came a story about the new wife of Hi Hi Over, the dancer, and after a time, Deep Red Roses forgot about the promise that he made to her and the promise she made to him. 6 Bits was the next to come along. There wasn't anything special about him. He was a careless man, moving from one job to another, from plastering walls to hanging paper to fixing roofs. But when he promised, she promised. But he never came when he should. He was always late for everything. If the wedding was to be Tuesday, he came on Wednesday. If it was to be Friday, he came on Saturday. And after a time, Deep Red Roses forgot her promise. She thought to herself, now, while I am young yet, I think I will go traveling, and I will find the wives of High Over, the dancer. And perhaps if I travel far enough, I will find the wife of Shoulder Straps, the soldier. And perhaps these women can tell me how to make promises that will be kept. And so Deep Red Roses packed her baggage, and she packed it so full that in the end there was only room for one more thing. And she had to decide whether to bring a clock or a looking glass. My head tells me to bring the clock, so that I will always know whether I am early or late. But my heart tells me to bring the mirror, so I will know whether or not I am getting older or younger. And after a time, Deep Red Roses decided to bring the clock. And she put the clock in her baggage, and she left her room and went out the door and went through the gate and onto the street. And then she turned around, and she went back through the gate and through the door and up the stairs into her room, and she put down the clock and picked up the mirror, for her heart told her she should take the mirror instead. Deep Red Roses looked at herself in the glass over the dresser and said, well, I am young yet, and I will do my own deciding. And so she decided that she would wait until the next day to decide what should be done. Now if you go there and you wait, you will see her. You will see her come out of the door and go through the gate and walk up the street. And if you wait, you will see her turn around and go back through the gate and into the house. And once she is in the house, she will put down the clock and pick up the mirror and say, while I am young yet, I will do my own deciding. And once again, she decides to wait until tomorrow to decide. And there she is, between her heart and her head. She stays home. Ready?
Yes.
3 brothers once had 3 wishes. How they got those wishes is not the subject of this tale. Suffice it to say they had them, 3 wishes, 1 for each brother. The 2 eldest brothers wasted no time in wishing that their pockets would never be empty of gold, and so it was. The youngest brother, let's call him Jack, because we can. The youngest brother wished that every woman who saw him would love him. Really? Well, he was young, our Jack, barely pushing 20. His 2 brothers wasted no time in making their feelings known. The oldest brother said, "Oh, you are more than a fool. One would think you were looking for trouble." The second brother was even more direct. "With enough gold, you can buy enough company," he said. Jack just smiled and kept his secret heart to himself. Now, the two oldest brothers wasted no time. They bought fine clothes and a fine coach and set out to see the world. And Jack was allowed to accompany them as long as he made himself useful, carrying the luggage. And they set out on the road. And it wasn't long before they heard a story that was traveling the highways and byways of the kingdom, and the story went like this. Now, the princess of the kingdom had refused to marry the man that her father, the king, had selected, and she had locked herself in her room and refused to come out. And the king was furious. "Let her starve," he said. "No one is to feed her. Let her stay in that room until she starves to death." Well, that wasn't going to happen, because the queen, who knew very well what it was like to marry a man that you didn't love, was sneaking her food every day. And finally, on the advice of nurse, the princess's nurse, the queen convinced the king that the princess was under some magical spell, something, and that the only thing to do was to let her choose her own husband. The king, who had a tendency to miss the finer points, decided that he would give the hand of the princess in marriage to anyone who could talk her out of her room. And the proclamation was made, and the line of suitors went out the castle door, across the drawbridge, and down the road. Now, when the two eldest brothers heard this story, they thought, we will go to the palace. Surely pockets never empty of gold are enough to coax the princess out of her room. The two eldest brothers, they weren't too good on the finer points either. And they set out on the road to the capital city. And once they were, when they had been traveling for about a day, they pulled off into an inn where the two oldest brothers' gold came in very handy, and the younger brother's wish took hold. The innkeeper was a fine figure of a woman, and she was standing on the porch watching the guests as they arrived. And she had an apron wrapped around round hips, and she was covered with flour from her wrist to her elbows. She had cinnamon sticks in her pockets, and she was listening to the guests as they arrived. And when she heard the high-handed manner of the two oldest brothers, she said to herself, "Oh, I know exactly what kind of guests those two are going to be." And she turned to walk back into the inn, and that was when she saw him, Jack. He jumped down from the back of the coach. He was hot and sweaty, and his shirt stuck to his back, and she watched him as he stripped off his shirt and he walked over to wash under the pump, and she could see that he was young, but there was a sweetness to his swagger that reminded her of her son who had been gone so long to war. "Boy," she said, "you, what's your name? Come into the kitchen and get dry." And so she brought Jack into the kitchen, and through skillful questioning and a really fine stew, she got the story of his life from him. Now Jack had been without a mother's attention for a very long time. And so when his brothers left, he stayed. He took care of the horses, he chopped wood, he washed dishes. He sat in the kitchen and he listened to the guests. He heard stories, he told stories, he listened more than he told. And the innkeeper talked to him about how to run the inn, and she taught him how to make pancakes as thin as parchment. But after a time, she put her arm around him and she said, "Now, Jack, you must go off and seek your fortune, for your fortune is not here. You must follow your brothers." And he called her mother, and she gave him as sweet a motherly kiss as had ever been given. And Jack set out with mended clothes and a knapsack full of sandwiches, a 2-pound sack of flour, and that kiss. Meanwhile, the two brothers had made it to the castle. Needless to say, pockets never empty of gold were not enough to coax the princess out of her room. And so the two older brothers were exiled to a desert island where their pockets full of gold did them no good at all. And there they stayed until the end of this story, and maybe even longer. The princess would not come out. Her father yelled, she stayed barricaded behind the door, and the queen and the nurse snuck her food every day through a system of pulleys and baskets at the bedroom window. And Jack, well, now he walked down the road, for his brothers were gone, and he went on his way to go to the capital city to catch up with his brothers, and he was fine. You know, he was walking, singing, happy. He never went hungry, he never went cold, because you know, there was that wish. And after a time, he came to a town, not the capital city, but a large enough town, with a white church on a hill. And he went up to the church and he could hear the music from inside. And so he stepped into that stained glass light and he could hear someone playing the organ and singing. And Jack, he just started singing that old hymn, and the notes rose up to the gilded ceiling of the church. And a voice called out, "Who's that?" And Jack said, "Well, it's only me, Jack." And the choir mistress, because that's who it was, she looked down and she saw him, and you know, there was that wish. And Jack smiled that smile that had so captured the innkeeper's motherly heart. It captured the choir mistress's heart too. For that sweetness reminded her of her brother, who had been so long gone for war. It wasn't the same war as the innkeeper's son, but there's always another war, so there it is. She found herself saying, "Do you need a place to stay?" And Jack found himself saying, yes, he did, and so he did. He stayed days, weeks. He learned songs, he sang, he learned new songs, sang old songs. Sometimes he just rested in the silence between the notes, and he perfected his pancakes as thin as parchment. But after a time, the choir mistress sat him down and she patted him on the knee and she said, "Now, Jack," in a very sisterly fashion, "Now, Jack, you must go after your brothers because your fortune is not here, it lies elsewhere." And so Jack, he picked up his rucksack, which, you know, had a lot fewer sandwiches and not so much flour, and with a sisterly hug around the neck and a promise to return, off he went down the road. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the princess was almost in despair. She knew that her father would soon think of thinning the line of suitors by something more permanent than exile, and while she knew she could not watch a man die, she knew that she could not marry against her will, and the only thing she could think of was to stop eating, and her heart was heavy. Her choices were not good ones. Her mother was worried and the king was impatient. And the line of suitors was still there. Meanwhile, Jack was tramping down the road, and he came to a bridge. He came to a bridge that went over the river, and he was hot and dusty, and so instead of going over the bridge, he went under it to a stand of willows by the river, and there he saw the fisherwoman. Now the fisherwoman was standing out in the water. She had her skirt tucked up around her hips, and she was casting her line out into deeper water. And she didn't realize that Jack was there until his foot snapped a twig and she lost the fish that she had been playing. And she turned around and said, "You fool, look at what..." Oh, you know, there was that wish. "Well, hello," she said. "Who are you?" "I'm Jack." And he smiled. Now, Jack had been on the road for some time, and his skin was tanned to a coppery glow, and that smile, those white teeth and that tan face and those light blue eyes. The fisherwoman looked at Jack. She had no brother or son to be reminded of, and her feelings upon looking at Jack were neither sisterly nor maternal. Jack looked at the basket of fish at the fisherwoman's feet, and he said, if you have any fish to spare, I would be grateful. Well, the fisherwoman had fish to spare, and then some. And after a time, after they had eaten, they sat down by the edge of the river, and it is amazing how well fried fish goes with pancakes as thin as parchment. And as they sat, the fisherwoman tossed some fishing tackle to Jack and said, if you want fish, you should learn to fish for them. Jack looked a little askance, but he camped there for quite some time. And the fisherwoman came to the river every day. She taught him about the currents of the river. She taught him the right bait to use for different fish. She taught him how to fish. But after a while, the fisherwoman said to Jack, now, Jack, it's been a pleasure, really. But you need to run along because I have things to do. And Jack looked at the fisherwoman and he said, he looked deeply into her eyes and he kissed her and he said, I will think of you whenever I see a river. That's nice, Jack, said the fisherwoman. Run along like a good boy. And off he went. Now, back at the palace, the line of suitors had dwindled, for the princess had proven to be most recalcitrant. The queen was thinking about spiriting her daughter away in the night, and Nurse was designing disguises for the journey. And Jack, he arrived at the palace looking for his brothers, and as he walked up to a sentry to ask if anyone had seen them, the nurse caught sight of him. She didn't know why. She thought that this boy deserved some attention, but she did. And she said, have you come for the princess? And Jack said, well, no, I was looking for come into the kitchen. And she hustled him down to the kitchen for a little chat. And down in the kitchen, the nurse told Jack the whole story about the princess with interjections by the cook, who kept filling Jack's plate with savory, because he's such a nice boy. And Jack, he had heard the story of the princess on the road, and he could understand her reluctance. His travels had made him a little wiser, and he knew that, an arranged marriage wasn't for everybody, and he admired a princess who could resist the power of a king and engage the loyalty of such fine upstanding women as Nurse and Cook so obviously were. And after some discussion, he decided that perhaps he would take a chance outside the princess's door. Now the cook filled his pockets with savories, and Nurse gave him a pillow because, stone floors are very cold, and she paid the guards to look the other way, and that night, there Jack stood, pillow under his arm in front of the door to the princess's bedroom. Now that door, it was an ebony door inlaid with walnut and hickory. The hinges were iron, and the lock, the lock was enough to stymie a wizard, never mind Jack. And although, a battering ram might have gotten through the door, it would require a running start. And though a battering ram could be acquired, a running start could not, for the hall was narrow and the distance short. And Jack stood in front of the door, trying to think of how he could possibly begin. And finally he said, my lady, your nurse said that you had been alone for some days and perhaps you could use some company. I have heard many stories on my travels from there to here and would be happy to tell you some if that would please you. And the princess on the other side of the door, she looked up. Her father came every day to shout through the door, but she had not heard a friendly voice in many days, that was true. And her nurse had sent this one. Well, tell me a story then, she said, if you will. And so Jack put his pillow down on the floor and he sat with his back to the door, leaning up against the door, and he told the princess the story of the innkeeper's son who had gone off to war and how he had learned to run the inn and make pancakes as thin as parchment. And the princess said, "You cook?" And Jack said, "Well, yes, well, pancakes. Sweet or savory, depending." "Depending on what?" said the princess. "Well, depending on how you cook them," said Jack. "There's pancakes with apples and pancakes with pears and pancakes with onions and garlic and beef." And the princess, who just several days before had been thinking of starving to death, was really hungry. And she said, "Oh, it sounds wonderful. I have not had warm food in many days." And she sat down on her side of the door with her back to the door. And they talked. And Jack told her about how the moon looked on the river and what the road was like early in the dawn. And the night went by. And Nurse came up and got him away from the door and brought him down to the kitchen. And the kitchen was in a tizzy, I can tell you, before no sooner had Jack gotten a hot cup of tea and sat down that the queen came bustling into the kitchen, and Jack stood up with his cup of tea in his hand and he bowed, and the queen, you know, there was that wish, she looked into his eyes and she realized that this was not a lord and this was not a royal suitor and this was not a prince, but this was a man who could perhaps save her daughter, and her heart began to beat a little more hopefully, and she agreed with Nurse that Jack should spend another night outside the princess's room. And the queen paid the guards enough money, enough gold, so that they didn't leave the door unguarded, but guarded from a distance. And that night, Jack went up and he put his pillow on the floor. But before, he took a nap. Having been up all night, he took a nap by the fire. And when he woke up, he cajoled some flour and sugar and eggs from the cook. And he made some pancakes as thin as parchment, sweet and light. And he covered them with a napkin, and he took them up to the princess's door. And laying a clean handkerchief down on the floor, he put one thin as parchment pancake on top of it. And the princess came over to the door, and Jack said, "Don't talk, just eat." And he pushed it under the door. And the princess sat down cross-legged on the floor, and she ate every pancake as Jack pushed it through the door. She ate every pancake with her fingers as Jack pushed them under the door. And then she got a pillow from her bed, and she sat down on the floor with her back to the door, and there they were, the two of them, back to back with only the door between them. And Jack told her about the choir mistress and sang her a song that the choir mistress had taught him, and she sang him a song that her mother had taught her, and he sang her a song that the Tinkers had taught him on the road, and she sang him a song that she had learned from the stable boys, which was actually quite rude. And the whole evening, and the whole night passed in songs and laughter, and when they were tired, they just sat. He never asked her to come out, because among other things that the fisherwoman had taught him, she had taught him patience. Jack told the princess about the fisherwoman. Not everything. But most things, about how if you knew how to fish, you could never go hungry. And that dawn, when he went to leave, the princess called him back, and she said, Jack, will you teach me how to fish? And a week of nights went by, and then more nights and more nights. And finally the night came when Jack stood with his hand on the door, wishing. And the princess stood with her hand on the door, wishing. And if it wasn't for ebony and walnut, their fingers would have been entwined. And their conversations became whispers from the heart. And that old dry door began to notice. And from a corner of the door there grew a curling green tendril of new leaves. Meanwhile, the soldiers were getting a little nervous because it had been quite a few days now, and what if the king found out about their dealings with the queen? I mean, he was not known for being able to keep his temper. And so they whispered about it and they worried about it, and all those whispers and worries, they fell down onto the floor and they skittered into the throne room and jumped up into the ear of the king. Oh, and he was furious. That's it, he said, I'm done. I am finished. Enough, I will go through that door with an axe. So help me. And no one had best get in my way. And that boy, head on a pike staff, he said, from the highest turret. Well, that night, Jack was sitting on the floor talking to the princess and telling her about these three brothers and three wishes, about money, and how the third brother had wished that every woman who saw him would love him. And the princess was laughing at the possible consequences of such a wish when the king arrived in the hallway, and he was in a fury. And he said, "Aho, what has been going on behind my back?" And the princess pounded on the door and she said, "You leave him alone." And the king made movements toward Jack, but the queen and the nurse got there first, and they stood between the king and Jack. And the king said, "Oh, rebellion. What is this scheming behind my back all this time? Head on a pike staff, I have sworn it. What have you been doing all this time?" No, don't try to save him now. And another, what are these leaves growing out of this door? And the voice of the princess came from the other side of the door, and she said, "Wait a minute, I'm coming out." And the sound of her unlocking the door cracked like a shot in the hallway. And Jackie said, no, lady, don't come out. Don't come out. Oh, this wish, this stupid wish. I'm cursed by this wish. Lady, please, don't come. I am that third brother who made such a foolish wish. I do not want you to love me because of a wish. And the door opened, and the princess came out. And Jack covered his face with his hands. And the princess reached out and drew his hands down from his face, and his eyes were closed. And she laughed, and she leaned forward, and she kissed him on each eye, and she whispered in his ear so only he could hear, "Jack, I loved you before I saw you. The curse is broken and all is well." And it was. And it was. The princess married the man who talked her out of her room. Her mother made sure of it. And now there was another story on the highways and byways of the kingdom. A story about Jack, who won the heart of a princess with stories and pancakes, songs and silence, patience and fish.